and we are truly delighted to welcome to UCD and to the Literary and Historical Society. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very, very warm welcome to Sir Stephen Fry.
Stop. Oh, you have. Listen, are you going to present me with something, or do you just want me to speak first? Right, okay. Listen, this is an extraordinary honor. I've been lucky enough to be given the odd present, the Dan Brown Prize for Intellectual Accomplishment. No, not really. I'm glad you've not heard of Dan Brown, actually. That gives me enormous pleasure and hope for you. But we'll probably get into this a bit later, but it so happens that your great alumnus, James Augustine Stanislaus Joyce, I think I should say, is a true hero of mine. He was an extraordinary writer, and one who still, to me, I think can be described as the greatest prose writer in the English language of the 20th century. Simply matchless. And I know that many people, including Irish people, find him difficult to approach. And I'll confess that I did too when I first tried to read Ulysses, because I'd come across some reference to it as being the greatest modernist masterpiece of the 20th century. I thought, oh good, I better read it. And I was, 12 or something. And I was physically upset and almost ill by how stupid it made me feel. And I think that is a perfectly legitimate response to a most extraordinary text. In a sense, it's a bit like, being told that Sherwood Forest or, the Yosemite Park is the most beautiful landscape in the world, and you immediately get lost and don't know how to find your way around it. And it takes years to realize how beautiful a landscape might be and how confident you might feel in moving around a dark wood or a lush tropical place where you can so easily get lost. And Ulysses is like that. But the more you live and the more it speaks to you and the more extraordinary it is. And of course, its perhaps third biggest character or fourth biggest character, or maybe its biggest character, is the city of Dublin. Joyce himself said that if Dublin were to be raised in a fire, were to be flattened by an earthquake, it could be rebuilt stone by stone by anybody who had read Ulysses. It's a slight exaggeration, I suspect, and it would be a peculiar Dublin that was rebuilt. But it is a magnificent book, and above all, it gave me this extra feeling for Irish. I mean English Irish, for the way you, if most of you may be Irish, the way you use our language. You do it better than we do. And it's often seen to people who have studied Irish literature that it is one of your responses to the brutal tyranny of British rule over hundreds of years, from Cromwell to, whomever you choose, Balfour. And that your revenge was not necessarily just to speak Irish and to refuse to speak the language, but to speak it better than the conqueror, to give it a spin, to give it a twist, to give it a romance that we constipated British are almost totally unable to do. And it is a hell of a gift. It's an extraordinary thing. And I just want to end, before you very kindly give me this award, is just to tell you of an experience I had with an Irish writer that changed my life forever, even more than Joyce, I have to say. And he, I'm embarrassed to tell you, went to another CD. It calls itself TCD. I don't know if you've heard of it. But anyway, I was about, 11 or 12, and it was a rainy Sunday. I lived in the middle of the countryside on the east side of Norfolk, east side of England, a county called Norfolk. And I turned the television on, and a film had started, and I didn't know what it was. It was set in the past. It wasn't Shakespeare, I could tell that. It wasn't a sort of Jane Austen-y bonnets and mob cap sort of Regency tale either. It was very elegant. And what astonished me was the way people were talking. I simply couldn't believe that language could be used in this way. Language, as far as I knew, was pass the mustard. Go away, I hate you. I said mustard, not that's horseradish. It basically just very ordinary communication and exchange of ideas and demands and so on. But here it was music, it was painting, it was sculpture, it was art, and yet it was also, and this is what was so astonishing, incredibly funny, as well as being sexy and beguiling, and it was funny. And at one point a young man knelt in front of a young woman and said, I hope I shall not offend you if I state quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection. And it was like I'd been hit by a sandbag on the head. Can you really use language to talk to people like that? It's an absurd way to express love. We're mostly brought up to believe that an Anglo-Saxon phrase, I love you, you are lovely, you are gorgeous, whatever, all basic, simple Anglo-Saxon honest words, but these folderols, these Latinate phrases, visible personification of absolute perfection, it's kind of both absurd. You can't love someone and then make up a sentence like that because your heart can't be involved, it's your head. And yet on the other hand, it's a magnificent present to give someone, to use language in that fashion. So anyway, I watched the rest of the film in absolute daze. I ran to my mother. Mummy, I hope you will not be offended if I state quite openly and frankly that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection. She said, what are you talking about? I explained what I'd seen. She said, oh, I know what that was. That was The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. And so we had a mobile library, as I'm sure you have, or used to have maybe in the rural parts of your country. It would come every other Thursday or something to a meeting of lanes, and I waited for it, and it hove into view and braked and stopped at a corner, and the driver got out and wheezed around the front and opened the door in the side of the van and let down some steps and patted my bottom into the... They used to do that in those days, that was fine. And there was a little librarian in there with, snowy white hair and powdery cheeks and spectacles on a chain, and she said, what do you want, young man? And I said, have you got The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde? She said, well, let us have a look. And there was the four comedies, Woman of No Importance, Ideal Husband, Lady Vandermeer's Wind, and that can't be right, and The Importance of Being Earnest. And I took them home and I hugged them to myself, and I read and read and read until I knew The Importance of Being Earnest off by heart, literally off by heart. I could not believe that language could do that. And it was wonderful for me because, you see, I couldn't sing, I couldn't dance, I couldn't paint, I couldn't draw. I was simply the most appalling sports figure you'd ever seen. The word that was shouted at me is not one that's acceptable anymore, but you probably know what it was. I was the kind of person, if a ball came towards me, I would clap my hands to catch it, and everybody groaned if I was in their team. And so I believed I was not good at anything at all. But suddenly I realized that I had this paint set in my head, this musical orchestra in my head, and that everybody had it, but that nobody else seemed to realize that it was a gift from nature that was the greatest gift that could be given to any living form, language. And that instead of just saying, pass the mustard and I hate you and fuck off and so on, you could beguile and dazzle and charm and use it to save yourself. I mean, I'm sure you don't have bullying in Ireland, but if you have a younger sibling who might be bullied, well, a younger brother, to be honest, you'll see why I say brother, you're very welcome to use I use this at school, absolute patent method to avoid being bullied. When the bully comes to you and raises a fist, you go, no, you mustn't touch me, I'll get an erection. And believe me, it's absolutely foolproof. Bloody hell. God. Oh. And they retreat, baffled. But anyway, so that began my love affair with language, which defined my life. It gave me everything I could possibly want. And that's led me, of course, to want to read other writers. And Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills, Wilde being Irish, that's why I chose Ulysses, which I didn't learn off by heart, but came back to later again and again and again. So to receive an award by a lord of language, a master, a genius like James Joyce, is really more meaningful than any other sort of prize I could possibly have. So I really want to thank you very much.
Thank you for those lovely words. I suppose to just follow on the Joycean theme, and in Ulysses, Joyce wrote that history, or he said history, Stephen says, but yes. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake. Given the current state of the world, do you agree with that assessment?
I do know what he means, and of course, unfortunately, the temptation is not to wake. And I'm sure many of you have been thinking, the world is changing, it's changing in a desperate and an extraordinary way, and something that we never imagined we would say is now sayable, that fascism is on the rise. The things are never, history, Mark Twain said, I think, doesn't repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. And there are rhymes in history that repeat and repeat. And of course, I'm not saying that Trump will build an Auschwitz or whatever, he's not exactly a Nazi, but there's an ideology at work, which is the ideology of the bully, which worships power. And if you look at the only leaders and countries that Trump admires, they are Putin's Russia, Xi's China, Lukashenko's Belarus, Erdogan's Turkey, Modi's India, Milei's Argentina, Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. They're all places with autocratic leaders who are slowly closing down the press. And they all do it in the same way that bullies do. They're whining victims all the time. It's not fair, it's not fair. They use a victimhood in order to be a bully. And they turn every truth you can imagine upside down. So their enemies, who are weak and disorganized and have no particular agenda, to be honest, they present as this kind of wicked, woke group of people who are burrowing deep beneath society to destroy freedom. And in order to defeat them, freedom must be destroyed. It's a madness, and most of us can see it, I think, and are frightened by it and enraged by it. But my generation, such is our spoiled nature, used to a time of prosperity and peace. I spoke to someone, a very well-known playwright who's won an enormous number of Tonys, and he said, I haven't watched the news since January the 20th, and I'm ashamed of myself, but I just find it easier not to know what's happening. And it's very easy to do that, to be ostrich-like and bury your head in the sand. But I suspect we must find an articulate way to protest and resist. And it seems a terrible thing to say, but spending money on defense, a thing I have always felt to be awful when compared to spending it on feeding and helping and making the world better and kinder, but it seems to be the only answer. And I'm reminded of a man who is by no means an unalloyed hero, but he is oddly enough to Trump, and that's Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill's maiden speech in the House of Parliament, the House of Commons, when he was a very young MP, was an attack on defence spending. And he enraged his leaders. Lord Salisbury was head of the Conservatives at the time, because Churchill felt that too much money was being spent on armies and navies and so on. At that point, obviously famously in the late 20s and 30s, he reversed it because he saw the world as under threat. Also, as a matter of historical interest, I'm sure you'll know, being a literary and historical society, Churchill left the Conservative Party, and he left it to join the Liberals. And the reason he left it was his strong opposition to tariffs. He was a free trader. He believed tariffs were destructive, and the Tories wanted them, so he left the Tory party and joined the Liberals. So, as if I need to say, Trump is utterly ignorant of the people he admires and of their history, but it is also, that is true. So, yes, I don't know, but I do think we must, those of us who really see this as a threat to, it's all, we should stop talking about abstract words, and I believe this, and I think those of you who love literature, the literary side of of your society will probably agree that using abstract words and, like peace and freedom are all very well, but what art does and good history does, it's this person here, these people here, this country, this reality for real human beings, not statistics, not numbers, and not what T. Hume, the philosopher-poet, called capital letter moralists who just say justice, mercy with big capital letters. These are meaningless words. We have to think about people and what the next 4 or 5 years will do for the people of the world, especially the most vulnerable people of the world, who are not the ones in the theatre of war, but who will be the ones who most suffer, the ones in the developing world.
You're clearly, obviously, quite clued into politics. You've spoken about Brexit quite a lot. Did you ever yourself consider a run for political office?
No, I did have a period, and it's not exactly a secret, but it's not particularly well known. I did have a period as a speechwriter for the leader of the Labour Party, or the leaders of the Labour Party for a while. I say speechwriter, it's slightly over-glamorising it. I wrote elements of speeches firstly for Neil Kinnock, who was a Labour Party leader in the 80s and the 90s, was defeated. And then for John Smith, who was leader of the Labour Party for a sadly short time, and died of a heart attack at quite a young age. And then for Tony Blair for a while. And I'll tell you why I stopped writing for Tony Blair. I mean, he's a smart guy, and obviously some people won't forgive him for Iraq and so on, but he certainly presided over a very successful Labour government and series of Labour governments. Anyway, when the Labour Party in Britain won, I'm sure it's very parochial, why should you care about English politics? But anyway, you asked the question, so I have to answer. It was in 97, May 97, quite a year, because in August of that year, Princess Diana died in a car crash, and then in September, as is typical in the calendar of politics in Britain, there was a Labour Party conference, and it was their first conference as a government for decades, really. I mean, since the 70s of Callaghan, way back. And I was tasked with finding some lines and paragraphs for Tony Blair to show that they weren't arrogant because of the landslide victory they had, that they knew they were servants of the people, and they knew that their time was limited, and that they were, and so on, anyway. So one of the things I wrote for him was, this is horribly me, and you would hardly get into any speech now, but I said, they say of Philip of Macedonia that when he was one of the most powerful leaders of the world, the Mediterranean world, he hired a person, and this is true, he hired a person who had a bladder at the end of a stick, and whose entire job was to leap out and hit Philip of Macedon on the head with his bladder, whether Philip was in bed with a wife or mistress or serving boy or whatever it would be, whether he was over a campaign table with his generals, whatever he was doing. He could be on the lavatory. He was free to do it. He was licensed to do it. And say to him, Philip of Macedon, ruler of the known world, one day you will lie rotting in a grave. What's known in the Catholic Church as a memento mori, a reminder of your death. And it's a useful thing. And anyway, so I sort of described this in a paragraph and said Tony Blair should say, fortunately, I don't need a bladder on the end of the stick. I've got John Prescott to do that for me. And Tony Blair did it. He said the lines. And I was at home in my house, and I had the television on thinking, I wonder which one of my lines will appear in this speech, which is what you do very excitedly if you are writing for a politician. And the only change he made was at the beginning. And for me, it was so revealing of what politicians are like. He said, I was reading a biography of Philip of Macedonia. I thought, you lying! What the... I had written, they say of Philip of Macedonia. And he had to change it to, I was reading. And I thought, I don't know, these people. But the thing is, in order to be a politician, you have to, well, I mean, have you seen what happens to them on Twitter or X, whatever the shade of politics they represent? They're just so the turds that are thrown into their faces. People want them to die. People want them to be humiliated. It is horrifying what people do. And now physically too. So you have to have a carapace of steel to do it. And we don't tend to like people who are so insensitive to insult themselves. We assume that it means there's a kind of narcissism at work, or some just deafness to human instinct that is not attractive or necessarily what we want in politicians, maybe.
I had the original question I had here was they said this, but I was reading a biography of yours.
Very good.
The Fry Chronicles. You describe how Hugh Laurie and yourself at Cambridge, when you were working together, had a horror of cool, and that you prefer to be yourselves. I think that's probably a prevalent theme, that a lot of people want to be cool. So what advice, I suppose, would you give to young people today who may be holding back from things and holding back from getting involved because they're afraid it's not cool? Like debating.
I think the thing about coolness is stylish. I mean, we've all got cool heroes, you know, but cool is best expressed, I suppose, by mirror shades. You don't let people in, but you look out, and it's cool. It's stylish, no question, and you know, it's relaxed, it's laid back very often. It's very attractive, but human beings, we are more than anything else driven by feelings, what we feel, our fear, our hopes, and my understanding of humanity is, yes, we want to be loved, but the really surprising truth is, more than anything, we want to love. We want to give out all this stuff we have in us, this feeling of wanting to create, wanting to connect, wanting to make a difference, wanting to give. You know, the tragic thing about, you know, obviously there are many tragic things about poverty, but one of the most tragic things about it is you can't give people things. I was reminded of this incredibly forcefully when I was doing some work in Uganda. I did things. The AIDS crisis in Uganda was beyond belief. There were these villages that were without adults. There were just children. It was like some weird science fiction film. And I remember going to one, and there was this. We were making a film about AIDS, and I was going to interview this boy of about 12, who was the head of his family. He had a younger brother who was not neurotypical, I don't know exactly what, but he was very sweet, and he loved animals, but didn't go to school. Whereas this boy went, and he had a sister, and the boy and the sister went to school. They walked 8 miles to school, and then he would walk back, and then he would do the garden. He had this amazing garden. And I arrived, having driven from Kampala, and with my arm out the window, and it had got sunburned. And the boy saw my arm, and he spoke a tiny bit of English, but we had an interpreter. I think his language was Nkose. And he said to her, "What's wrong with this big white fella's arm?" And she explained, and he looked with big round eyes. And anyway, I started talking to him, and he showed me the potatoes. I said, "What are you growing here?" He said, "Irish potatoes." He did say Irish potatoes. And I said, "Oh, lovely, I love potatoes. And look at my tummy, of course I love potatoes." And then we talked about, his life and his ambition. And he said he wanted to be a doctor. And I said, "What sort of doctor do you want to be? Have you decided yet?" And he said, "This morning I thought I wanted to be a doctor who would help bring an end to AIDS. But also I am finding now a very important new duty. There is a problem I have been told about, that white people have this terrible burning with the sun, and I would like to find a cure for this." I thought, Jesus, that's amazing. And I obviously said how great it was. And then we were sort of slowly packing up and going to film somewhere else, and he looked a bit distressed and asked where I lived, and I said I lived in London. But he frowned, and then he babbled something to the interpreter, and she said, he wants to know your actual address so he can send you some potatoes when they have grown. And that just reminded me, and I wept, and who wouldn't? It was just so extraordinary, and yet, of course, really one should have said, yes, of course. If I was like that. I would want to give the pride, the joy, the look in someone's eye. Whether ask anyone who performs a task for other people, if they're really good at it, the chances are they're good at it because they're looking for that thing in the other person's eye that tells them they've made them happy. You ask any great chef, that, yes, they shout and they scream and they want their Michelin stars, but it's about seeing the face as the fork goes into the diner's mouth and them going, wow. And an actor, it's the applause, it's the unique, and the opportunity to give is so much better than the opportunity to get, I think.
I think one of the things that, there was obviously that famous Gay Byrne incident where you spoke about bone cancer in children. You're an avowed atheist, and for an avowed atheist you spend a lot of time writing about gods. What fascinates you about gods, or what do you find attractive about them?
Well, I think gods are a good way of telling a human story, and if the mythology happens to tell you that God, there is only one of them, and that this particular one is filled with love for all humanity and all creation, and knows everything, and and can see everything, and can do everything. In other words, omniscient and omnipresent, and I was going to say omnivorous, but omnipotent. Yeah. If that mythology says that, then what that's telling us about humanity is that there's a very screwed up idea of subservience to something that couldn't possibly be true. And why did that happen? Why did this monotheistic God, who was apparently full of love, happen? When there is bone cancer in children, when a volcano can slide down and kill a whole family, I mean, you don't have to address human evil, just the evil of random malice and chance that happens in the universe as God made it, if that God did make it. Why would he do that? If he's omnipotent, why did he want to see suffering? Just in order to prove that we loved him? What kind of maniac would do that? It's just extraordinary. So that's why I'm interested in that God, but which is not to say that I disapprove of pious, individual, devout and devoted people who fall on their knees and want to follow the laws and canons of the church or faith that they cleave to. It's not my business to mock them, but I can mock the more powerful members of it. A bit like Flaubert. I don't know if you know that, the Trois Contes, the three stories. There's one of them about this maid, Felicity, who falls to her knees. And Flaubert has a fantastic go at the stained glass window and the bishops who've placed themselves next to Mary and Christ, so I think you can have a go at the bishops and the cruelty of, and as I think I was saying to you earlier, this idea of Christ was a very interesting figure, whether historical or legendary or mythical or a mixture of all three. Certainly interesting, and what happened after his death is obviously fantastically interesting as history and so on. But the idea of this carpenter going to Rome and standing at the Bernini Arcade and then going towards St. Peter's and seeing the work of Bramante and Michelangelo and the marble and going, hang on, did you misread? This is not what I meant at all. So that's interesting. But then the Greek gods are interesting too, because what a way of telling a story about humanity. If you look out the window, as it were, you see a world that is absolutely beautiful and majestic and remarkable and so fabulously well made and populated with such extraordinary creatures. It is a miracle to look at that. But it is also cruel and unfair and capricious and mean and wrong in places. So if there are gods, they must be like that, majestic and fantastic like Zeus, but also dreadful and dishonest and capricious and mean. And that's what the Greeks understood, which is why I so love the way they reveal the truth of our existence through the truth of their gods. And it's not that I believe in them exactly, but I do believe in the wonder of storytelling and of myth and even of ritual and ceremony. I think they're marvelous ways of displaying truth. And again, it's a bit like saying, it's the distrust of the general and the abstract, and the pleasure of seeing things acted out by people. And the gods are, in that sense, are human.
And your friend Douglas Adams wrote a book once called The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. And in this book, it turns out the Norse gods are real, and they're really cross that everyone has long stopped worshipping them. Are you worried that it could be the Greek gods that are in fact real, and that Zeus will be angry with you when you show up at the days or the doors of judgment?
Well, I suppose what I think of the Greek gods is you can. There's a really interesting thing that hit me a couple of years ago. I've always been very interested in AI. Right from the 70s, I read a book by a man called Marvin Minsky. I don't know if you're aware of him. He's actually the person who coined the two-word phrase, artificial intelligence, and he founded the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in MIT in Boston. And he was, and I was then lucky enough to meet him in the 80s, and he was remarkable. And so I've always been interested in AI. And then it suddenly occurred to me when I was writing Mythos and telling the story of Prometheus, this extraordinary thing struck me. And this is the power of myth, really. It's the understanding of it. When you think, really, the first thing myth is saying at its very beginning in its creation stories is a recognition that humans had, especially once language arrived, which is very recent, as you know. It's only 50, maximum maybe 60,000 years ago that we had this thing put in our brains somehow. And we started to ask questions, much, much later, there was the agricultural revolution that gave us calories that meant we could settle down more, but also language and tool making had allowed us, if you picture the cliche of a cave and a big meal has been finished, the bison or whatever has been eaten, and one member of the family is drawing on a cave wall, as they love to do, and one of the children asks, where did we come from? Why are we different from animals? And it's a most important question, because all humans obviously saw that we were, in some sense, animals, because we eat and mate and defecate in exactly the same way as animals do, especially the ones that are most like us, what we would now call mammals. And so they knew we were, but they also knew we were different, very different, because of the way we were speaking and asking questions and making tools and controlling fire. And there was a strange difference. How did that happen? And this is something that all myths tried to explain by telling a story. Abrahamic religions, we go back to the Eden myth, of course. But the Greeks imagined this figure, Prometheus, who was a titan, the race that came before the gods. But he was one of the titans who took the side of the gods in the war, and the king of the gods, Zeus, and he were best friends. And at one point, Zeus says to him, you know what? It's lovely having animals and nymphs, but we should make a whole new species of creature that would be more like us, kind of little versions of us, but obedient to us, and they could praise us and sing songs to us and sacrifice to us, and they could be our playthings, our little creatures. And Prometheus said, all right, well, I'll see what I can do. And so he took some clay and he made little creatures. And Athena and Zeus came along and breathed into them the divine breath. And we woke up, and there we were, little creatures. And Prometheus, who made them, our master, as it were, our creator, adored us and said, oh, I'm going to teach them everything. I'm going to teach them how to sail and how to knit and how to shear sheep and how to make swords. And whoa, said Zeus. Well, just a minute. He said, you can teach them some of those things, but what you can't do is give them fire. You cannot give them fire. And Prometheus said, why not? And Zeus said, well, if you give them fire, they will one day be greater than we are, or they won't need us anymore. They will stand on their own 2 feet and will become extinct. And of course, by fire, you can tell in the myth that what is meant is both the literal fire that roasts and toasts and melts and smelts and bakes and so on, but also the divine fire, the strange self-consciousness and the creative ability that spark. Well, Prometheus loved us so much that he went up to Olympus with a fennel stalk, rather strangely in the myth, and with the fennel stalk he poked it into the fire on Olympus where the gods lived and took fire down and gave it to mankind. When Zeus saw this, he went insane and punished Prometheus appallingly, chained him, or had him chained to the Caucasus, the mountains there, and every day an eagle would come and peck out Prometheus's liver, because Prometheus was immortal. It would grow back overnight, and this just happened every single day. It was agony. Well, okay, that's a myth. It's an interesting myth, but the fact is, of course, eventually the gods were sidelined. Humanity, through fire and many other things, did not really need the gods anymore. It invented its own single god that allowed the hierarchy of the power of priests and the control of other humans. But the old gods, the old pagan ways, the golden age, disappeared. And you may say, well, that's a myth for them, for the Greeks. No relevance to us whatsoever, really. But, interestingly, when in the 18th century, or the 17th century, it began really, of course, I suppose, that slowly mankind shook off the shackles, Ireland a lot later than the others, of the church, the ecclesiasticism that had strangled human development really for 1,000 years, at least the Dark Ages and the early medieval time, and slowly the Renaissance and what was then called, the Age of Reason, the Age of Science of Newton and so on, and then followed by the Enlightenment, as it's often called, in which new ideas came forward about our equality and the idea that we didn't have to be subservient to priests and kings and dukes and so on. We could be free, we could make our own mistakes, and we didn't have to believe a text that had been handed down and that was controlled by priests. And so a new age of revolutions, and of course they brought their own problems. The French Revolution brought the terror, the American Revolution led to Trump, but nonetheless it was an extraordinary step in human development, as we know. And at that time, it's an extraordinary thing, but within a few months of each other, virtually, Beethoven had written The Creatures of Prometheus, which is a wonderful piece of music, a dance and a piece of music celebrating the creatures of Prometheus, which is us, in other words, the creatures that Prometheus made. And Shelley, the poet Shelley, wrote Prometheus Unbound, a poem in which Zeus and Prometheus argue about whether it was right to give man fire. And most famously, Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, wrote Frankenstein, which is subtitled A Modern Prometheus, about someone who makes a human being. So there was a very good reason for them to rediscover the myth of Prometheus, because the myths of Christ and the dominating God had dissolved, and they wanted instead a champion who put us first, which is what Prometheus did. And again, you may say, well, that was then, now we've forgotten it. But here we are in exactly the same position that Prometheus was in when he had created us. We have started to create almost sentient entities that we call AI, but which will fuse and meld with robotics and bio-augmentation and brain-machine interfacing and stem cell and genomics and CRISPR editing, basically so that we will, like Prometheus, very soon be creating other beings. And we will be the gods. We will be Zeus. And we are asking ourselves the question, do we give them fire? Do we give them what is sometimes called AGI? Do we give them artificial general intelligence, a self-consciousness? Or do we allow it to develop, more likely, so that they will think and feel for themselves and have impulses and needs and desires for themselves and have that spark? And if we do, they may destroy us. Because what the Greek myth shows us is, in a sense, it's happened before. God's created us. We became bigger than they were. Of course, in the Greek sense, we don't really believe Zeus was real, but we believe it's a very smart way of saying, why are we different from animals? We've got this thing, this extra spark. What does it give us, this divine spark that we have, this self-consciousness, this ability to name animals? I mean, a koala bear is not interested in a South American tapir, doesn't know about it. If it saw one, it would either want to eat it or run away. I mean, but we have this feeling of responsibility for creation, which is godlike and is absurd and is, of course, arrogant and so on, and we betray it in the way we treat the material world and the living world. But nonetheless, that's just a very long answer to a very interesting question about why myths do still tell us crucial things that ordinary created fiction, because myths are not created by an author. They're not the same as Tolkien or J.K. Rowling, who create their sort of legendarium, as they're sometimes called. They are the voice of, Carl Jung called them the collective unconscious of all of us, our instincts and our feelings.
And just to, I suppose, change tack a little, but stay on the same subject of great books, is you're a prolific writer, you've written many, many books, and you've spoken about the anxiety of meeting deadlines and letting people down and things like this.
Yeah.
When it comes to writing, do you enjoy the process of writing, or is every book a painful birth of art, I suppose?
It's a really interesting, it is painful, but it's, I could be like James Joyce and say it's like taking a really difficult shit. It's painful and it's terrible, but oh my God, when it slides out at the end, what a joy, what a triumph. That's a revolting way of putting it, perhaps. But you know, I sometimes get asked, I'm the president of the Hay-on-Wye Literary Festival, and so, you know, do these sessions with other writers, and it's really interesting, and writing is a thing that's talked about, and very often, I mean, always in the Q&As, there are questions people ask. They want to know about the writer's process. It is very important to people because a lot of people feel they can write, and the chances are they can, because they can speak. If you can speak, you can write. You don't have to spell well, you don't have to punctuate. It's not a school composition essay. Writing is just freezing speech into a system of ideas and stories that will stay there, that are mostly stable, give or take modernism. And so people want to know. They want to know literally, do you use a pencil, or what word processor? Do you use Pages or Word, or do you use Ulysses? Funnily enough, is a good word processor. Or,
do you?
Oh, it's a Markdown. Yes, that's the one I do use. It's a Markdown program. Anyway, and people want to know what time of the day you get up, and I can understand this because, and this, you know, I, like all writers, had immense problems. You know, in my case, when I was a teenager, I desperately wanted to be a writer. And I would start so many things and not be able to finish them. And most people who have ever, you know, said, oh, I tried to write a novel once, and, you know, what happened is they wrote the first chapter or the first few pages, and it came flowing out of them, and they thought, this is actually really pretty good. They stayed up late, and they woke up the next morning excited, and maybe they finished a whole chapter, and then they started a second one. At some point, bang, they hit a wall, a really high, unscalable, it seemed, wall. And they didn't know, and sometimes it was a technical thing. How do I get her out of the room and across the other part of town? Can I just cut like in a film? You know, all those sort of technical questions suddenly arise about how you move characters around in a story. And do you say he said, she said, or do you say he remarked bluntly, or is that a bit crap? And oh God, and I'll better look at some Hemingway. Jesus, I can't write like that. I'll look at some Joyce. Oh Christ, I don't even understand it. And you know, I'll look at some J.K. Rowling. No, it's different, because it's a different world. I'm not writing that sort of story. And confidence leaks out of people. And it's very understandable. And as I say, I've been there myself. One of the things that inspired me was reading a quotation from Thomas Mann, the great German novelist. And he said, a writer is just an ordinary person who finds writing more difficult than other people do. There's a weird paradox, and you think, oh, that's just being clever. But it's true. And actually, it was Douglas who first alerted me to this. Douglas Adams, he was a very good friend before I'd written a novel or anything. And I would go to his house sometimes. We used to swap computer programs, and we were very, very nerdy together in the early days, before the Macintosh arrived even, you know. One day I found his publisher there, and she said, you're not to, she was Canadian, I don't have to do her accent, she said, you're not to go up, he's got to finish this book. And so I would sit down with her, and she somehow persuaded me to write a book for her. So I told Douglas this, I said, Sue has commissioned me to write a novel. And he said, oh, wonderful. He said, I hope you know how hard it is. And I said, are you trying to put me off? He said, no, not put you off. But I'm trying to make you understand that the day will come when you suddenly think, oh no, this is too hard. That's the day when you start writing. You have to understand how difficult it is before you can do it. And if you're surprised by how difficult it is and it makes you think, I can't be a writer because I find it so difficult, then you've made a terrible mistake. You can be a writer because you know how difficult it is. You suddenly realize this is an extraordinarily hard thing to do. Crazily hard. You've written what you think is an amazing amount, and then you look and you think, it's just 15,000 words. You know, the average novel is 80,000 plus. This is just, oh my God, you know. Okay, it's not coal mining, it's not discovering the South Pole or anything like that, but it is extraordinarily hard. And once you know it's hard, and it's always going to be hard, then in a weird sort of way, it's pleasurable. Because you know how much time it's going to take. You know you might have 4 days of writing brilliantly and fluently, and then a week later you will delete all of that. You know that's very possible. And it won't break your heart because you've hardened yourself to the amazing adventure of being a writer.
Oh, incredible. And I suppose just one final question for me before I open it to the floor is, I was originally at Oscar Wilde's grave in Père Lachaise, and you've spoken very much of your love for Wilde. In fact, you were nominated for a Golden Globe when you played Wilde.
Yes.
Even today, his grave is covered with flowers and lipstick. What is it about Wilde, do you think, that transcends the generations? I mean, he's been dead over 100 years.
It's a really good question, and of course, well, there are different ways of putting it. I should begin where you started, which is the end in a way, which is that grave in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. The Irish government, along with the municipality or arrondissement, or whatever it's called, where the cemetery is, recently gave quite a lot of money to have his sarcophagus there, the Jacob Epstein sarcophagus, made in limestone, sandstone, to have it restored. Why did it need to be restored? It wasn't the weather. It was the fact that it had been kissed so much that it had started to erode the substance, the sandstone, which is because so many people had come to kiss it. So in a sense, I'm repeating what you say. Why is he still so extraordinary a figure? I remember, before I imagined I would ever play Oscar, I was occasionally asked to go and talk to colleges and schools and things, or be in a debate or something, and sometimes the very nice students would invite me back for a drink and a meal in their rooms or whatever. And way back, the kind of posters you'd see on a student's room would be Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, maybe Karl Marx, Che Guevara. Because if the world was going to be saved, students believed, it would be by rock and roll music and the counterculture that represented, or by revolutionary politics. And slowly I noticed those posters would disappear, and instead you'd be more likely to see Albert Einstein and Oscar Wilde. And students, perhaps for good reason, lost faith in the counterculture, which had disintegrated into drugs, commercialism, murders, early deaths, and, general crapness, sadly. Revolutionary politics was, frankly, Russia and East Germany, China were not shining examples to anybody, nor was Cuba. So instead, the life of the mind, and in the case of Einstein, a mind that most of us can't even grasp, but we could see in that blind internationalist sort of face and features something noble and humanitarian. And in Wilde, we saw something else. We saw the student prince, you might call him, the ruler of Bohemia, that territory where students and permanent students live, people who never give up their studentness, who always are interested in art and difference and celebrate otherness, and have this sense that Wilde is their kind of patron saint in a strange sort of way. And there is, if one wanted to go down that path without offense to Christians, there is something messianic about him in a sense, that he had disciples, followers, and he was brought down lower than any figure in his contemporary world, to prison, 2 years hard labor, which was not, he was not expected to survive. People of his class didn't. He was a big and slightly flabby figure, but he did at least survive it, but not for very long. He then went to Paris in exile and disgrace, and died at the age of 48, I'm sorry. So that was a tragic and sad life, but slowly. And a picture came to me once when I was in New York, and this will sound very strange, but it does make sense. If you've ever been to New York and in Manhattan, and you've taken a taxi down Fifth Avenue goes downtown. Some of them are two-way, Park Avenue, but most of them go one way or the other. And this one goes downtown. And if you happen to do it sort of early in the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning after a party or something, and you're going down in the back of a cab, you're lucky, because then this marvelous illusion happens was that when you pass 34th and 33rd Street, the block is the Empire State Building. And the first time I did this, the driver, who was a friendly and could tell I was not American, said, there's the Empire State Building, I'm sure you've heard of it. And I looked out the back, and I could just see the base of it, and then as the cab crawled forward, because this was in the daytime, there were other buildings closer to the cab that dwarfed it. Although they were obviously smaller, it's that effect you have, that this microphone can be bigger than me. If you standing there, it's bigger than me. But if it's there, it's much smaller than me. You know what I mean? It's just, it's not parallax exactly, but it's an obvious effect of distance and so on. But if it's 3 in the morning and you're in the cab, and the lights go green in sync, which they do in New York, so it goes green, 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 the cab can zoom down. And if you look out of the back, you see this amazing thing. The Empire State Building is like a rocket taking off from a launching pad. It just gets higher and higher and higher and higher and higher as the other buildings just drop away, because they're revealed in their small pygmy-like stature, and this thing becomes bigger and bigger. And when Oscar Wilde died in 1900, he was nothing, he was nobody, his name couldn't even be mentioned. Secretly, gay people would blush if someone said the name Wilde. That you can, read it in their memoirs. Somerset Maugham, when he was a medical student, someone said the word wild, meaning wild as in untamed, and he went completely bright red and started to tremble and shiver because the name Wilde had been uttered, and he didn't want people to look at him and think he might be guilty of the same unpardonable sin. So his name was absolute mud. And writers whom we've now forgotten were bigger than him and were celebrated. But as the decades passed and people rediscovered his way with language and his way with thought, he became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and is now one of the true giants of world literature. If you go to Japan, he's probably the most read English language author that they have after J.K. Rowling, I suspect now. But that always used to be the case. Same in Romania and in South America, all kinds of places. A lot of bookshops, the shopping bags will have Oscar Wilde. He stands for literature, for art, for another way of being. And he wrote himself, he said, if you want to be a general or a bishop or a grocer or a judge, you will be it. That is your punishment. But if you don't know what you want to be, any day to the next, if you live a dynamic life, what I call the artistic life, then your reward is the mystery of every day, not knowing who you are and being able to rediscover and make yourself. The creative act of being a person is an artistic act in itself. And I think that's something, especially you, I hope, as students, will feel you don't want to lose. You don't want to lose it for a world of, I don't know, having a lawnmower. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a lawnmower, but you know what I mean, as a symbol of just another way, And Wilde is that, he is that, as I say, that student prince who stands against it.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for answering my question. Perhaps not too fitting. I perhaps should have ended with the question about James Joyce, but I think Oscar Wilde is such a fascinating character. I suppose maybe we might take a couple of questions quickly from the audience.
I've gone on. I do go on.
That's
and on.
okay.
I'm really sorry.
I think it's our privilege to listen. So thank you very much for that. Have we any questions from the audience? And I'll run up quickly.
Anything is possible.
Hang on a second.
There's someone there with a white top. I think I can see her. Is it? See them?
Hi, I'm just wondering, in all of your speaking on the Greeks and the gods, what would be your favourite or most revered interpretation of them by somebody else, whether that be a particular translation of a myth or something?
Yes, no, good question. I grew up with the Greek myths by Robert Graves. He did 2 versions, one for children, which I first read. Robert Graves was a poet and writer, and he wrote I, Claudius as well, which is a fabulous novelization of the early emperors of Rome. Amazing. So Robert Graves was that. But what's been interesting is in the last few years, really, around the same time I wrote Mythos, and I'm not claiming any part in making them fashionable. I think I just responded to a feeling that humans had. Maybe we needed the gods at this point. But there's been a particular new generation of wonderful classics, students and writers. Madeline Miller, the American novelist who wrote The Song of Achilles and a book about Circe, she tells these amazing novels from the point of view of Greek characters and gods. Pat Barker, The Silence of the Women, tells the story of the Trojan War from the point of view of the women in it, who are pretty, not exactly absent from Homer, but they're certainly not foregrounded, shall we say. Bethany Hughes, a lot of them are women. Emily Wilson has written translations of Homer and so on. So there's and there are a lot more people are becoming classic students. I get a lot of letters from children who are saying they're going to read classics and study classics at university, classical studies. You don't have now to be fluent in ancient Greek. You know, it's possible to read courses in classical civilization and literature and philosophy and history that combine the very nature of the ancient world and so on, and give it a much less chalk dust and schoolroom feeling than it used to have. You know, indeed, the very words, the Greek words, you know, the Clytemnestra sounds like, a sexually transmitted infection, to be honest, doesn't it? Indeed, but words for sexual parts of the body sound like nymphs. Oh, clitoris, come to me now. So it is the fact that Greek is used for parts of the body and for diseases, so that the names sort of make you think of that. And that's, I know it's trivial and facetious even, but actually it is a stumbling block for a lot of people. They think, I can't, these words. So I hope things like audiobooks are helpful. And I will just quickly say something, if I may, and this is quite dangerous. So I'm not making a comment in any direction. But what I would say is that it is very hard now to write a novel set in the present day. Your enormously successful Sally Rooney manages it, and so do others. But to write which doesn't address what you might call the discourse, that are anxieties and concerns about race, gender, transphobia, about slavery, about our right to be white people enjoying power, about maleness and toxic masculinity, about all the things that are part of the conversation, the discourse. It's very hard to write something set in the present where your character, he's a person with a job here, she's got this, they've got that. What do they stand for? What is their position on it? Do I like them? What do they say? What language do they use? And it's very hard not to use the tests and filters that we apply to people so that they pass muster, that they think the correct thoughts. And the beauty of myth is that you can talk about honor, love, betrayal, death, anger, hate, all the primal human emotions that fuel us. You can talk about them stripped of the particular anxieties, details, and nuances of our age. So you get a kind of purity of investigation that is possible when you look at the ancient world. You can judge the ancient world. So, Athens, it's all very well to talk about the glory of its philosophy and its mathematics and science and its open and new ways of thinking, but it was also a place where women couldn't vote and there were slaves. So, of course, it wasn't a paradise in any way at all, but nonetheless, it's a magnificent sort of place to examine ourselves without getting bogged down in our current obsessions, perhaps. Someone want to give a wave? Oh, there you are. Three of them. You can ask the three fates, the three furies.
I was just wondering, what is it about Wilde and Joyce that fascinates you so much? Because obviously, personally, I adore Shakespeare. I'm guilty of bardolatry, and I've seen to be frank, I've seen your 12th Night and your Malvolio kind of stole the show. But I would just like to know, what is it that I suppose that you find so fascinating about the way I suppose the Irish writers would write compared to the Bard?
Yes, I mean, I'm with you, as Matthew Arnold said of Shakespeare. Others abide our question, thou art free. There is something quite extraordinary about. I was going to begin my speech here by stealing kind of idea from Mark Twain, which was he began a speech at the Albert Hall when he was traveling Europe. He said, ladies and gentlemen, William Shakespeare, the greatest poet-dramatist who ever lived, is dead. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the greatest musical genius the world has ever seen, is dead. As a matter of fact, I'm not feeling too well myself. But I think with Shakespeare, of course, it's a far enough distant age, and the heightened world of his characters and the poetry he gives them, although there's much more to him than that, allows him this separate status. Whereas with Wilde and Joyce, they're close enough to us and to a world of, with Wilde, a world of courts and the beginnings of motor cars even in his life, and with Joyce even more so. He died in 1941, and the Dublin he brings to life, although he never came back to Dublin after 1912. The Dublin he resurrects is full of people that we who speak a language that we understand and were not as distant as Shakespeare's. And so the fact they tell us, Wilde and Joyce, that you can live in the modern world and still be poetic in your use of language. You can still thrill with your language. It's that excitement, I think, is which I said earlier, that this realization that we can all have, that we have this palette of colors and brushes and things in our heads, and this, these musical scales and things. We don't need a specialist education in music or painting to be musical and to paint with words, to use them. And the fact is we do it all the time. And a few of you have spoken, but you have used language, and your brains have processed language and worked to process language exactly the same amount that I have as when I've been speaking. In other words, the point is to receive language takes as much skill as to give it out. And I remember doing an event with the great American writer Gore Vidal once, and someone said to him, Mr. Vidal, can you say, well, there are no more great writers anymore? He said, oh, I don't believe there are no great writers anymore, but it gives me a melancholy feeling to recognize that there are not many great readers anymore, which is a kind of typical Gore Vidal. But the point is, reading is an act of creation as much as writing, and the coming together of a writer and a reader and an audience and actors is what the creative and performative arts are all about. And so I suppose it is about being an audience, I think that a lot of people started to write about Greek myths 10 years ago, and they're popular again because readers wanted to hear stories that connected with them better than other stories happened to be connecting with them at the time. In other words, these things are made up by readers. So the first duty we all have, and no matter how much you write or want to write, is to be a great reader. And if you love acting, is to be a great member of an audience and to participate in the creative act, in the literary and historical acts that you celebrate as the LHC? H, you say in Ireland, don't you? You say H. And it takes so much of your lung power to do it, just to say H. In the dictionary, it's spelled in English, A-I-T-C-H, H. But you speak it, yes, and the Irish H has crossed the Irish C, it has to be said. Maybe the next one we'll have to say SES for the letter S. Anyway.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together one more time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Lovely people.